Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. The Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And today we are doing our sort of second part on guns, on trying to make sense about guns and gun violence. This is coming after our first part of this two-parter last week, where I was talking with David French in a Good Faith Classic episode, and we were trying to make sense of guns from a sociological and a policy perspective, making sense of gun culture and gun control measures. So I really encourage you, if you haven't listened to that episode, to go listen to that episode. And this episode, though, I want to talk about making sense of gun violence itself, not just gun control or gun culture, making sense of gun violence. And here, I want to begin with a little just theological reflection on the limits of making sense of evil in the world. Because gun violence is evil. Anyone who has experienced or witnessed or just seen the devastating damage that gun violence does to individual victims, to families, to entire communities, you know it is an evil, evil thing in the world. And there is a limit to how much Christians can make sense of evil in the world. And that's because evil, by its very nature, is senseless. It assaults our senses because it is something that should not be. And therefore, when we read a story or we hear a news story of yet another, say, mass shooting, there can be something arising in us that's asked that question, why is this happening? Why? We're wanting to make sense of it. And we can make sense of it from the vantage point, again, of gun culture and policy measures. But at sort of heart, I think many of us are at an existential, moral, spiritual level trying to make sense of gun violence by asking that question, why is this happening? And here I want to say that we cannot ever actually make sense of something as evil as gun violence because it is evil. When we are trying to answer the question, why is this happening? We're looking for something that explains it away, that makes it okay, makes it at least a little better, makes it a little more sensible. And we can't make sense of evil because evil by its nature should not be. There's no good reason for evil. The reason why I'm saying this is not just because I think it's important, not just for gun violence, but for any evil we experience in the world. I've had two good friends recently get just horrible cancer diagnosis, and I know that what arises for their friends and even for them is this, like, why is this happening? And the reality is there's no good answer to that question because cancer, like gun violence, is just evil. Now, God can redeem evil. God can bring good out of it. And this is what we're going to talk about today. But evil by itself cannot be made more sensible. And this gets back to that. Ultimately, in confronting the evil like gun violence, the ultimate Christian response is not to make sense of gun violence, but it's actually to fight it, to fight evil in the way that Jesus fought evil on the cross, with creative, redemptive, often suffering engagement with the world that confronts evil in surprising ways. And that's why I'm excited for my guests today, Michael Allen and David Dillon. And let me introduce both of them real quick. Michael Allen is, we were kidding afterwards, we were like brothers from another mother, where he also, like me, is an immigrant from Jamaica. And also with a vocational history as a pastor. And he served as a pastor in Chicago for many years as a senior pastor of Uptown Baptist Church. David Dillon is a business executive in technology and banking, leading large firms, and also his company. We don't share those things in similar, but I suspect we share many other things in similarity, including I also grew up in Chicago. And the interesting thing about why I'm bringing Michael and David together is that the two of them together founded this organization, this ministry called Together Chicago, in response to the epidemic of gun violence in that city. So, Michael and David, welcome to the Good Faith. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Curtis. Absolutely.
All right. So I want to start by Michael with you. Michael, just explain for our listeners, what is this initiative called Together Chicago?
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. So Together Chicago is really a backbone organization that we say we do four things. We convene a table of influential leaders. Um, we converse about a very hard subject like gun violence. We covenant to do something about it. And then we collectively catalyze our resources of time, talent, treasure, and influence to address the issues of gun violence, seeking to reduce gun violence and increase thriving communities. And so that, in a nutshell, is what Together Chicago is all about.
Okay, so Michael, I can imagine, and I want to hear more as we talk, like how you got involved because you're a pastor of
Mhm,
a church that is engaged in the community, and so
mhm,
gun violence naturally, I think, would be something that, as a pastor, I can imagine why you want to get involved in this.
mhm.
David, you're a business executive on the intersection of technology and banking in Chicago, including leading your own firm. You're a white guy who is not rooted in I don't think, as I understand it, like rooted in the same communities that are most affected by gun violence in Chicago. uh, why the heck are you involved in this Together Chicago, and how did you co-found it with Michael?
Good question, Curtis. No, it's been an incredible journey, and I did want to just mention one other thing that we do have in common is I'm also an immigrant.
Ah,
I spent my first 17 years in Japan. Uh,
all
I'm a
right.
I'm a missionary kid from Japan. So um,
Excellent.
yeah, but to answer your question, yeah, I think it's been a work of God in my heart for a long period of time that really started. I got to the United States in 1973. And coming from Japan, I really knew nothing about the civil rights movement or kind of the struggle within Chicago, and started learning about Chicago. And as you know, Chicago is a very divided city. It's approximately one third African American, Hispanic, and white, with about 5 or 6% Asian. And I started asking a lot of questions about why is Chicago the way it is, and particularly around the divisions. Like the African Americans generally live on the west and the south. The whites are north. You've lived in Chicago, so you know what it's like. And it's like, why
Even the
is it
baseball teams are have a racial kind of division to
exactly
them at some level. Yeah.
exactly? So I think I just was really interested and ended up getting involved in some nonprofit organizations that were working in the city. One in particular called Sunshine Gospel Ministries that's had a 100-year impact in Chicago, and just asked a lot of questions about that and started reading books. And I think through my reading and discussing with people, God just used that to put on my heart just the extent of the injustice that's occurred in Chicago. When there's a book called Family Properties that God used to really impact me, and it goes through the details of how the African American community was really, money was stolen from them through redlining and all kinds of things where they were not able to get mortgages, and just the amount of the injustice that's happened in Chicago is incredible. And so I think then it all culminated for me in 2016 when Chicago had this very difficult year of 4,200 shootings and about 800 homicides.
Wow.
And in that year, that's actually the year Michael and I met. We can tell you more about that. But in that year, God just put in my heart that the body of Christ has got to be involved in this. Like, it's not okay for us just to sit back and just say, "Oh, that's the police's issue. That's the mayor's issue." It's all of our issue. And think about the number of Christians in Chicago. If we got engaged in this, couldn't we make a difference? So I think that's the best answer I can give you. It's really, I think, a prompting from God over a period of many years.
Mhm,
Michael, tell me your story of how you got connected to the issue of gun violence, and then
mhm.
yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, so Curtis, our church, Uptown Baptist Church, it's on the north side, about a mile northeast of Wrigley Field, where the Cubs play baseball. But it's also one of the most ethnically and socioeconomically diverse neighborhoods in Chicago. Of the 77 neighborhoods in Chicago, Uptown is like the second or third most ethnically and socioeconomically diverse neighborhood. So in our neighborhood, there are several rival gang factions that live and operate there. And our church, being engaged in the neighborhood, one of the ministries we had, long-standing ministry, is a ministry to the poor and to the homeless, to provide a hot meal and some fellowship on a Monday evening. And one Monday evening, about 10 years ago, while sitting in the back of the sanctuary, one of our late speakers was giving a devotional to our guests who come in from the streets. We give them some soul food before we give them some belly food. So they're in the sanctuary getting some soul food before being dismissed to go downstairs to the basement in our fellowship hall. And I heard what sounded like at first, loud fireworks. And I looked on my watch and at the date and realized this is August 9th, not July 4th. And so chances are those were probably not fireworks. So it felt just like it. I felt the concussions in my chest. And so I stepped out of the sanctuary, looked downstairs outside the church building, and saw 5 people bleeding on the ground.
Oh my.
And blood was literally pooling at the church steps. And so I called 911 and went down to attend to the people until the ambulance came. One of the men who was shot in the head, we believe he was the intended target. He died within 48 hours. The other 4 people recovered with flesh wounds. And that shooting, Curtis, is what God used to so trouble my spirit that it set a new direction, a new trajectory for my life and my ministry. And that is when, like David, I began asking questions like, what is driving the violence? Trying to make sense of it, as you mentioned at the outset of this meeting. But I was trying to make sense, not to explain it away. I was trying to make sense of it from a spiritual, scientific purpose of saying, okay, now that I understand it, what can I do about it?
Yeah.
How can I, as a pastor, lead my church to be engaged and involved to minister on both sides of the gun? I wanted to know who were the perpetrators pulling triggers and who were the victims, and why the perpetrators were pulling triggers and why the victims were being shot. I wanted to know that so that I could step in and try to minister on both sides of the gun. So that was my purpose. That was my reason for trying to understand what was going on. And after several months of convening meetings with influential leaders to try to understand this epidemic, that's how I met Dave Dillon, through a mutual friend of ours by the name of Brian Dye. He was a house church planting pastor on the West Side. And we were mutual friends with him, but David and I did not know each other. And so Brian, having gone to one of Dave's meetings where he was convening very similar meetings that I was convening with influential people, Brian said, "You guys should meet each other. I think you're trying to do the same thing." And so David invited me down to his office downtown and sat in his conference room. And as we shared what God had put in our hearts, it was identical.
Huh.
And we knew that God was doing something, because that's just a very rare thing to have 2 people as different as he and I are, to have such a passion and a directive, as if the Lord saying, no, this is you should be engaged in this, and
Wow.
and you should involve the church in this. And what if the church could come together and do something together? So that's how I got involved, and it eventually led me to end my pastoral ministry in the local church and to begin a new sort of pastoral ministry in co-founding and co-leading this nonprofit in ministering to our city on a broader scale.
So, David, you pick up the story from there. You guys meet in your office. You have this sense of connection that God has brought you both together with the same passion and cause. How does that meeting go to something as big? And I want you to also describe the scale of Together Chicago at this point. Like, give me the story that goes on from that initial meeting to where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to share my thoughts that Michael and I just stood and in amazement looking at each other going, this is unbelievable that I mean, we had never met each other, and both of us feel like we're pretty networked in Chicago. I've lived in
Hmm.
Chicago for a long time, and Michael has, and literally we'd never met each other, never heard of each other until that
Hmm.
meeting. It was kind of amazing. But in 1 hour, we realized we both felt coming out of that meeting, this is something that God is doing and wants to do. And so what happened from there, Curtis, is we decided to bring our larger teams together. We each had mobilized teams of leaders, and I had started praying with 12 leaders that I considered to be kind of the dream team in Chicago, people who had really focused their lives on this issue of gun violence and dealing with care for people who are affected by it. And so we had met a number of times. We were praying, and Michael and I both said, "Hey, you've got a group, I've got a group. Let's get our groups together." And so what that led us to was a weekend retreat in Galena, Illinois, at a ranch that a friend of ours owns, and we had about 40 guests there that weekend, and it included some of the prominent pastors in Chicago, household names, James Meeks and Bishop Horace Smith, and famous pastors like that that we're thrilled to today say are good friends of ours. But yeah, we kind of just brought the larger groups together and just kind of laid out our thoughts, and started talking with them about this idea of what could be done. We also just had some fun, played some golf, had some good meals, but then it also culminated in a prayer time. And I'll never forget that prayer time as long as I live. At the end of that prayer time, it was like the Holy Spirit, in my opinion, I think Michael feels this way, was just present with us in the room. And I think everyone who was there left that prayer time saying, this is beyond any one of us. This is something that God is doing and wants us to do. And so we're going to double down on this. And it was a very, very encouraging time. And I think everyone who was there would say, this has never happened quite like this before in
Right.
Chicago, where you had, African American leaders, Hispanic, white, both business, people in the mayor's office. I mean, just a wide range of folks, government, pastors, all coming together for a single purpose of, how can we as the body of Christ do something about this gun violence in Chicago?
Hmm. Hmm.
Michael, I want to ask you this question about your approach with Together Chicago, which seems like the name of the organization
Hmm.
signifies. It's bringing people together who
Yeah.
may not otherwise find each other and uniting them
Hmm.
around fighting gun violence. I'm
Hmm.
struck by your strategy here, your mission here, because I think the instinctive response to gun violence as a solution for many people is there must be some top down government program that just solves the problem, like from a top
Hmm.
down mandated solution by fiat, by force, by coercion, or something.
Hmm.
And different people will have different versions of that. But your approach is like the complete reverse of that.
Hmm.
It's bottoms up, it's
Hmm.
relational, it's organic, it's building relationships. Why is that the approach that you've chosen, and what results has it delivered?
Yeah, that's a great question, Curtis. I think um, part of the answer has to do with the fact that David and I are both highly networked people. We have a lot of things in common, and probably the top two is that we love God and we love people, and we each have a large network of people, and we love to see people come together to collaborate and maximize our impact. One of the founding documents that we adopted was that paper. I think it was a white paper published by Stanford University, titled "Collective Impact," which really looked throughout history and determined that no lasting social good has ever been accomplished without collective impact. And so collaboration was a big part of what we knew had to happen in order for us to move forward. And as we looked at the history of Chicago and what was going on and had been going on in Chicago, we saw um, that previously there were so many barriers. I mean, we had folks who were in silos trying to get at this issue, whether it was the police, the mayor's office, state's attorneys, some churches and nonprofits, etc., just kind of doing their own thing, but not really working together. And I think God began to break down a lot of those barriers to say, hey, now is the time. I've removed some of the socioeconomic barriers, some of the geographic barriers, some of the denominational barriers. Because as you look at our approach, we've got Baptists, Pentecostals, Methodists, uh, even some Presbyterians working together with us. And David is Presbyterian, I'm Baptist, so we
I
kid
got
each
it.
other
All right.
about that. We kid
This is
each other about
the
that all the time.
dividing wall of hostility that has been broken
Yeah.
down.
But then we have Cubs fans and Sox fans working
Oh, no,
together.
no, now we're
I
getting
mean,
serious here.
yeah. And we have Southsiders and Westsiders and Northsiders. We've got Democrats and Republicans. And so I use this illustration, Curtis, to help people understand this. Most people know about the Great Chicago Fire. Imagine if the Great Chicago Fire was happening today in your city or any of the listeners' city, and you saw the fire, you smelt the smoke, and you realized that the wind was blowing it to your location. Would you run around outside after calling 911 to report the fire? Would you run around saying to people, hey, are you Baptist or Pentecostal, because we need to put out this fire? Are you a Republican or Democrat, because we need all the Democrats to come put out the fire? Are you white, black, or Hispanic, because we need all the white folks to come put out this fire? No. And why don't we ask those questions in a crisis like that? Because the fire doesn't care if you're Democrat or Republican. The fire doesn't care if you're Baptist or Presbyterian. The fire doesn't care if you're rich or poor, red, yellow, black, or white. The fire just consumes everything that's in front of it. In the same way, this epidemic of gun violence is really like that fire. It doesn't care. Bullets don't care whether any of those labels. They just pierce anything that's in front of it. And so people in Chicago began to say, you know what? This fire of gun violence is getting too close for comfort. I don't care what your label is, as long as you have something to help me put out this fire, I'm willing to work with you. And so our collective impact model, I think it's an it's something which time has come to be implemented in not only our city, but I think any city across the country where God has been at work tearing down these barriers and silos. And so as a result of this model being implemented, we have about 170 churches that are collaborating together like never before in one way or another in one of our 5 initiatives. We have 70 schools that we're at work in and collaborating and connecting those churches with schools. We're working with the mayor's office, the police department, with law firms, with businesses, all around this issue of trying to reduce the gun violence on the one hand and increase thriving community on the other hand. And it's happening because people realize we cannot do it alone. So the government officials have admitted we can't do this alone. Police have admitted we can't do this alone. The churches are beginning to realize we cannot do this alone. And so everybody is kind of has this um, it's like a Weltanschauung, as they said in Europe, theologically speaking. It's like this aha moment where everybody looks up and realizes we cannot do this alone. So we have to come together. And when we come together, and if we come together, we will get more done together than we can separately. So we're always going to be better together than apart. So I think we've been able to move the ball a little further down the field. We've seen some violence reduction in the neighborhoods that we're working in, and we're beginning to see some of the increasing and thriving. And by thriving, we mean more kids graduating from middle school and high school, less kids dropping out, more kids going off to college or to trade school, more folks getting livable wage jobs and stable housing, and more families staying together, getting connected to faith, houses of faith and worship. So we're we can measure those things of thriving, we can see that we're making some progress. And when we're able to measure the violence numbers, we can see we're making some progress based on our collective impact with our partners.
I think it's important to just underline again how much collective impact is increasingly recognized as like the necessary, not the only, but a critical part of responding to complex social
Yes.
problems, social evils like
Hmm.
gun violence. Because again,
Hmm.
and it sounds like it's not that Together Chicago is running just by itself a bunch of
Correct.
programs. That's not
Right.
the right way to understand Together Chicago. You're
Hmm.
like convening, you're bringing people across all these different sectors who
Hmm.
are all running their own programs, but you're
Hmm.
bringing them so that we're doing it more together in more coordinated fashion with greater collaboration. Is that the
That's
right
right.
way to understand the collective impact?
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, and I
Dave,
And
think
I
I'm
think,
sure you have something to add.
yeah,
I do. Yeah, I just want to jump in and maybe make it a little bit more concrete, Curtis,
yeah,
just to give you kind of where we started more specifically. So, on the near west side of Chicago, there's a housing development called West Haven Park. And that used to be one of the high rises that got torn down in the mid 2000s. And there's many of those across the city. But it's still been a troubled area. It's a wonderful area. It's been rebuilt into mid rises. It looks very nice from the outside, but there's still a lot of violence that happens in that community. And through a number of connections, we were asked to really get involved deeply in that particular community. And so what started happening is us meeting, number one, all the other nonprofits that were working there, trying to understand what they're doing, who they are. Number two, working with the security company that was managing security for that particular housing complex. We started working with the owners of the housing complex, with two different companies, real estate companies, who asked us to come in. We started working with the police and the police sergeants and captains in that area, and so we had regular meetings, regular time together saying, hey, if there's a shooting, what happened? Who shot? Why were they shot? Is there a follow up? Is there a retribution that's about to happen? What are the gangs that are involved? Why are these gangs fighting? So that collective impact just started getting a lot more information around the problem of what was going on and why it was happening. And I think that that's a key part of this is there are always reasons for a shooting, right? Shootings don't just happen for complete randomness. I mean, sometimes people are hit by a random bullet, but the person that shot the shot in the first place had a reason for the shot, right? And so what
Hmm.
we're trying to get at is what's going on? What's the core reason and what's their frustration level that takes it to that point where they think that's the solution? So in West Haven Park, after all this work together, we actually started to see the numbers actually go down pretty dramatically. Within about a year of our working there intensively, the numbers had gone. In fact, at one point in time, we see the measurement, by the way, from the University of Chicago Crime Lab. They put out a data portal that the whole city can see, and it changes on a daily basis, so it's very dynamic. But at one point in time, we measured that the homicides and the shootings were down by about 60%
wow.
from the time it had started. So we know that we were having an impact. And yeah, it was a very exciting time for us to realize, all this work is actually starting to pay off. So that maybe makes it a little bit more concrete for you.
Hmm.
And was there ever any other collective impact response to gun violence in Chicago, or were you guys the first ones? Where did you guys get this going?
That's a good question. There's an organization called CP4P, Communities Partnering for Peace. And I believe they started right about at the same time as
Okay.
we did. And we were just brought into that group. So it's a group of about 14 to 16 other organizations like Together Chicago that are all working specifically on the issue of gun violence, trying to reduce gun violence. One difference, major difference, is that we have a more robust, holistic approach in terms of having five different strategies or initiatives to approach the issue of gun violence. Most of these other organizations have maybe two or three at the most, and so, but we work together as a collective, and we learn from each other best practices, and then we also raise funds from government entities, whether it's federal, state, county, or city, and then those funds are shared across the organizations for us to continue to do our work. And so, again, there's another example of this idea where separate organizations doing similar work come together as a collective to say, what can we do together and how can we work together to be better together at reducing numbers across the city. And so I don't know that we were the first ones, but when we first started, everybody in the room that Dave talked about, those 40 influential leaders, they all looked around and said, you know what? We're all doing good work across the city, but we don't know of anybody that's doing work like this together. And therefore, we're willing to allow you guys to use our resources, our name, our influence, because it's way past time for us to come together to do something like this. There was some uniqueness there, but I can't say exclusively that we were the only ones.
David, I want to ask you about trust because it seems to me that collective impact requires a very high degree of trust of each other, of different sectors, different organizations that maybe in the past competed for funding. And then also, when I think about the work that you're doing on both sides of the gun violence, you're talking about like police on the one side and gang members on the other side. Oh my gosh, the level of trust you have to build to
Mhm.
make that kind of collaboration happen. So talk to me about trust. How did Together Chicago build this trust?
Curtis, I'm so glad you're highlighting that issue. In fact, when we speak publicly, we always talk about that particular topic, and we have a phrase that we believe in strongly, which is change happens at the speed of trust. And we really
Yes.
believe in that. And so, yeah, I think there's so many different dimensions of this. I think the first dimension is what we were mentioning about the group of leaders that we brought together. The first dimension of that is did they trust us, right? And that didn't happen. I mean, in that one room that day, a lot of trust happened, but then it had to be followed up, right? They had to see that we were serious about this, and we were going to continue, we were going to fund it, and we were going to get funding, and we were going to do all the things necessary. So that trust started to grow within that core group, which was a key thing. Michael has had a long time relationship with a number of key leaders in the police department, and so he started cultivating those relationships. And Michael's been doing, and we can get into this more, but a particular type of visitation to those likely to be shot or to be shooters, along with the police. And so I think that's a key thing that we should talk about more here in a second. But those relationships started to really pay off. And then we started talking more with other pastors across the city and really letting everyone know that, hey, this is not just a South Side thing or a West Side thing or a North Side thing. This is a holistic across the city thing. We started talking to business leaders and government leaders, the mayor's office, et cetera, et cetera. And so it just took time. I mean, trust doesn't happen overnight. And so we've been at this now for over 6 years. And I'd say the trust, continues to grow. Now, there have been moments in this that I would and you have to call out the challenges too, right? There are nonprofit organizations who didn't like the fact that we were kind of coming into the community and trying to do this work. And they were basically like, hey, we're here. We don't need you. Why are you here? You're going to take our funding. We don't necessarily like that you're here. And we've just had to kind of go in there and say, look, the problem is big enough that there's so much to do. Like, let's not
Mm-hmm.
argue over this. Let's work together. And so Michael mentioned the other organizations in CP4P. We always work very closely with each of those because sometimes our boundaries overlap a little bit between the areas that
Mhm.
we're working in. And we always go to them and say, hey, here's who we are. Here's what we're doing. We want to work collaboratively with you. Where do you think we should work? How can we work together? So we have a very collaborative approach to everything we do. Um, but I'd say that the trust has grown, I think, partially because we try to take this attitude, and I think to some degree we've been successful, which is we're not trying to take the credit for anything, honestly. We would rather that our name not show up in the newspapers, not show up anywhere, that the name that shows up would be the local police or the church or the business or the mayor's office. We want everyone else to get the credit. We just want to see the numbers go down. So I think as people start to realize that, hey, they're not, publicity seekers. You don't see us on the evening news. Even doing like these kinds of podcasts, we do them because we believe in what we're doing, but we don't seek them out, honestly. and we're not trying
Nope,
to
that's
make a
true. I saw you guys out. So
true. Yeah, we're not trying to make a name for ourselves. And yeah, so I think as people start to see that and see it over a period of time, they start to trust us more. So yeah, Michael, what would you add to that?
Yeah, one of the probably the greatest low trust population that we work with are uh, the members involved in group violence, the gang members or tribe members, as they refer to themselves. They are very, very low trust. They don't trust hardly anybody outside of their gang.
mhm.
Um, and one of those gang members who now works for us, a man by the name of Lavanas Troop, he has testified now publicly in several venues where he's had the chance to share his own story, where he says, you know, when I first heard about Together Chicago and when they came into my neighborhood where I grew up, I was very skeptical of them because I've seen other organizations like them who come into our community. They get all this funding and they don't do anything and they just enrich themselves. They make all these promises, they break every promise they make, and they don't do anything to improve the community. And he said, but I decided to give Pastor Allen and Together Chicago a chance and to watch and see if they're going to keep their promises. And I can testify today that every promise that Pastor Allen has made and Together Chicago has
Mm.
made, they have kept. And that has instilled in me a trust for this organization. And so now he's a biggest proponent of our organization as a former chief of one of the gangs in the areas that we serve. And so that's a great testimony that I like to share when I'm asked this question about trust, because it's a very good question and it's one that needs to be answered.
I
Say
would.
more about this particular program that David was referring to about this visitation program, because it seems to me like that's a very concrete expression of rebuilding
Hmm.
trust after an incident of gun violence, which just naturally just rips a community apart, right? And all of the
Yeah.
fabric of trust, it gets ripped apart in violence.
Hmm.
So, what are you trying to do with this visitation program? Describe it and describe
Yeah.
what results from it.
Well, as you know, our hearts have all been um, captivated in one way and broken in another way when we see the overreach of police officers who uh, kill unarmed black men and women in their line of duty. And those videotape messages have come across all of our screens, social media, and news media, et cetera, in the last several years. That's just been heart wrenching for all of us. Those incidents, as few as they are across the country, have added to the distrust between many of the black and brown communities in our country and the police departments that work in those communities. And so, this program that was adopted by not only the Chicago Police Department, but many other police departments across the country, um, this program has in part been able to help rebuild the trust that has been broken in many of the black and brown communities where those acts of violence against those citizens by police has taken place. Um, and so, in a nutshell, this program is where the the commanders in those police districts, and we, by the way, Together Chicago, we are an official partner of the Chicago Police in 6 of our 22 districts to help run this program with the commanders in those
Hmm.
districts. So that the commanders will call us up. One of the pastors that now works with us on our team that we've trained to do this work, those pastors will go out with the commanders and other officers to go and visit, let's say, the top 5 or 10 most violent people in their district. And they go most often unannounced. Sometimes they'll call and make appointments. Some districts do that, but most of the districts just go unannounced to where they know these people live because they have actionable intelligence as to where these folks live because they've arrested them many times over the years. In some cases, have seen these young people, now young men, grow up from the time they're 13, 14 years of age, getting arrested, to now they're in their 20s and still engaged in gun violence um, in and out of prison. And so we go and visit these folks. The police gives them a message of warning, and then the police introduces us, and we give them a message of hope and help. And the police basically tell them, put the guns down, or else we're bringing the heat on you and the other members of your community. But today's your lucky day because we're not here to arrest you. We're here to introduce you to someone, and a pastor in your community, who can offer some help. The police then step out of the way, oftentimes stepping outside the home or the apartment, and then the pastor's left in the home to then build a rapport very quickly with that individual to say, hey, we love you. We care about you. God loves you. God cares about you. Let us help you. The police will stop you if you make them, but we will help you if you let us. And that
Mm.
is the message that we provide to them. And after 3 or 4 minutes, we give them a card, say, hey, all you have to do is make one phone call, connect with me, your local pastor in this neighborhood, and we will provide whatever resource you need to help you make different decisions. Could be finishing a GED, could be job training, could be a job, it could be groceries for your baby and your baby mama, it could be um, relocating to a safer neighborhood. And so it could be mental health counseling that they may need. So whatever resources that they think they need, and they tell us, hey, well, I need this, 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 and this, we then work to begin providing those resources through case management to deliver to those individuals. And it's been quite effective. About 50% of those that we present that offer to do not recommit with a gun, another offense. And about 15% of those guys that we offer those resources to will take them and say yes. I need. They'll reach out and ask for help, and we begin that process of trying to help them. So
Michael, it makes it seem like that. So again, when we're talking about gun violence, again, not as trying to make sense of it theologically or spiritually, but sociologically, which I think we are called to do. One thing that you seem to be saying is that a sociological driver of gun violence is just hopelessness and
yes,
isolation. That guns
yes,
are kind of the last resort of the hopeless and the
yes,
isolated, and you're trying
yep,
to actually address those
yep,
root conditions. Is that right?
100%, Curtis. You have understood this correctly. One of the things that we've learned in interact in so we've done hundreds and hundreds of these interactions, and all of these individuals again are repeat gun offenders,
Mhm.
sometimes starting as young as 13, 14, 15 years of age. Now we're talking to them, they're in their mid 20s. They've been to prison many, many times. They've got holes in their bodies, and they've put holes in many other people's bodies.
Mm.
And these young men have lost hope in America. They do not believe that the American system of economics works for them.
Yeah.
Therefore, they still have to pay rent, they still have to eat, they still have to feed their kids. And so they decide, because they've lost hope in the system of justice and as well as the system of economics, they've decided to go about earning their keep in the shadow illegal economy. And so this program, as well as our street outreach program, where we also hire former street gang members into our organization, we train them to go back out. Like we go out with the police, that's a separate program, but it does similar things. These guys, though, have street cred
Mm.
because they're the OGs, the old
Yeah.
original gangsters from 20, 30 years ago who have survived prison and survived death by gunshot. They now take their credibility and history and knowledge of the street life to the younger guys that are still out there to try to convince them to put the guns and drugs down and enter into this pathway of peace and prosperity in the legal economy and to leave behind the illegal economy. So, yeah, it's really all about restoring hope and faith in the American way of life that you and I, participated and believe in, and use to our advantage in a good way, in a legal way, to participate in the economy. So
Hmm.
yeah.
David, I want to ask you about what the organization has learned through failure, because it's very easy with these kinds of discussions to just like talk about the arrival point of we have
Mhm.
this great model, look at our great results. I
Mhm.
think all of us who know who've done tried to do anything redemptive in the world, trying to confront hard, complex problems like gun violence, know the process is more like you're groping your way there through oftentimes as much failure as much success. Give us a picture of what were some of the failures that you went through and what did it teach you guys?
Mhm. Yeah, Curtis, I have no problem in talking this about this topic because we certainly have many of them. And yeah, I think there's a couple different categories. One is just in terms of our team structure. Sometimes we have made some mistakes in who we brought onto the team, and there have been some painful lessons learned that we hadn't really fully vetted people. I mean, you can imagine the complexity of the environment we're dealing in, right? And sometimes someone looks good on paper and they seem good, but once you really get to know them, it really isn't what you thought
Yeah.
they were. And so we've had a couple of those situations that have been very painful. I think another thing that's happened is just as I mentioned, some of the rival nonprofit organizations. I mean, we really kind of got iced out of some things where people said, we really don't want you here, and that was painful. I mean, that was a painful process to go through. A third category is just the numbers of violence themselves. I mean, like I said at the beginning, we saw some really great results, but some of our results are not that great, honestly. And we're now working across 4 areas in the city. And I wish I could say, the violence is dramatically down in all 4 areas, but that's not the case. And so it's just, the violence is complicated. And even though you do everything you know how to do, some weekends you'll find out that there's been horrendous violence that happened over the weekend, and then we just sit and pray. We're like, Lord, what more can we do? What more do you want us to do? But it's very painful. It's very painful for us as an organization and for us personally. So yeah, we've definitely had our share of failure for sure.
Michael, we began by talking about how this vision for Together Chicago began with the friendship between you sitting down with David, realizing that God brought you guys together. I want you to talk more about that relationship and how it's grown over the years. What have you guys learned from each other? How have you shaped each other in your character, in your spirituality? Like, what's that been like?
Well, I could tell you that I really respect David. I respect his business acumen and his ability to get things done. And I tell people that although we are alike in many ways, we're very different in some ways as well. And it's kind of like a marriage in that we completed each other in some ways. And so there are areas where he is weak and I am strong, and other areas where I am strong, or I am weak and he is strong. And so I lean on him from time to time, even this week, just trying to deal with some of the staffing challenges that we have, and just protocol and processes, because he is a longtime successful business guy. He deals with a lot of this stuff uh, on a day-to-day basis that I haven't had a lot of experience in. And so I will say, hey, Dave, how should we approach this? How should we handle this? What is the proper way to go about this? And I look and listen for his wisdom and guidance on some of those things. And then there are some other areas where I'm like, okay, Dave, help me understand this here, and let me into this, and let me uh, uh, also share some input in this area, like some of our leadership. So, when when we first started, Dave decided to be the president, and we agreed that he'd be president of the organization. But then one of our big donors looked at our organization and said, well, we are prioritizing our family foundation to give to Black and Brown led organizations. And they didn't see me as a leader or even a co-founder and a co-leader in this organization because Dave
Hmm.
was president. So I said to Dave, that's not good. If we're being perceived as a white-led organization, simply because you're the president and I don't have that title, whereas I am a co-founder with you, but not listed as such in anywhere in the organization, we've got to change that. And that was a hard conversation to have. But we had that hard conversation and decided that I would be the co-founder and the co-CEO. And then we had to have the conversation with our board and explain the reason why we thought this was the way to go. And many of their board members said, well, we've never seen a structure like this before, and we're not sure this could be a two-headed monster and
Yeah.
lead to a big disaster. But we're going to trust you guys to work it out. And so we made that decision, I think, sometime last year, and so far it's been working out pretty well. Every once in a while we bump heads on something, but then we work it out and we figure it out together. So it's but we're joined, like he says, we're joined at the hip. And we even had this conversation with our wives. We said this is like a marriage. Dave and I. This is my work husband. you know, in a way, uh, and we've got to figure certain things out and just talk it out. And by God's grace, He's enabled us to do that. We're both mature believers, and we're committed to this organization. We're committed to our relationship, and we're not afraid to have the hard conversations and to say we got to figure this out and let's do it. So
David, what has the relationship been like from your experience?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I can just say I really like Michael, and that helps a lot. I genuinely like him. He's a funny guy. He's fun to work with. He has what I call Michaelisms, and he's always cracking a joke, and so
mm,
he can make a very tense situation kind of lighten up, and I think that's great. Um, I think the other thing I'd say is that Michael and I are both men of prayer, and actually our whole organization has adopted kind of a prayer focus. And I think that there's a certain humility that comes from praying together. Every single staff meeting we have, we start and we end with prayer. We each pray privately, we pray together. And so, I think there's something where we both realize, right, our authority only exists to the extent that God gives us that authority, right? We're under God's
mhm,
authority. And so there's not a big ego battle going on. We're just like, if we ever have a difference, it's just an honest difference of opinion. And it's not loaded by, well, I'm more important than you or whatever. It's never about that. It's just
mhm,
about let's work through the issue, right? And so it makes it a lot easier to work things through. Um,
mhm,
and Michael has tremendous gifts. I mean, I've seen that firsthand. He has almost single handedly made great relationships with police commanders, police leaders, pastors across the city, et cetera, et cetera. And I've done that also in the business community and the government community. And so I think
mhm,
God's just, as he said, kind of wired us in similar ways,
mhm,
but enough difference where I think the two of us together make a 1 + 1 = 3 kind of thing. So
mhm,
yeah, it's been wonderful.
I want to ask both of you guys about the perception of your relationship with each other from your respective networks. Because knowing Chicago and how racially divided that city is, like David, you mentioned at the beginning, and Michael, you too. And again, how you are coming from different sectors, business, community
mhm,
based, church, and so forth, like that. I have to think that you have people in your lives that are like, what are you doing with that guy? And
mhm,
so how have you guys responded to that? How to
Mhm.
the questions about your relationship and this work that you are so joined at the hip, married
mhm,
together in this way?
mhm.
Michael, you start, then I'd like to hear David's take on that.
Well, one of the things that we do is to tell our story so that people can see it's a God story.
Mm,
So I point out the fact that, okay, Dave was born in an island nation with the letter J. I was born in an island nation with the letter J.
Well, there you go.
Dave has dimples. I have dimples. Dave.
As do I. So we were talking about this. We're the dimple gang here,
Right.
with the secret power of dimples to flash
Right.
as a get out of jail card whenever we're in trouble.
100%. Dave loves the Lord. I love the Lord. Dave was raised in a Baptist, tradition. I was a Baptist pastor. And so I start out by talking about a lot of these commonalities that bring us together. And to Dave's point, with a little humor thrown in to just, help people kind of ratchet down a little bit. And then I said, but he's this, older, white, successful business guy. And I'm a pastor, Black Baptist pastor, that does not have a lot of business savvy or knowledge. And so there are some differences there. And what's interesting, even among our staff, when we first started this organization, I could see that a lot of times the staff would go to Dave because they assumed that he was, and so they made this assumption that Dave is a final say so on everything because of those three things. He's white, he's rich, and he's older. And so that again was an issue that I had to come to terms with, and I had to address and say, Dave, this is another reason why we need to see ourselves as co-equals leading this organization together, because we don't want people, whether within the organization or outside the organization, to have this false perception that you're the guy, and thereby diminishing my responsibility and my equity as a partner, co-founder, co-leader in this organization. And so that those are some things that I think, I've had to have private conversations with both members of our staff and some of our donors, and some outward facing folks outside the organization looking in, trying to understand our relationship and how we function, how we work. So when we changed our titles and adopted the same title, that fixed a lot of that outward perception of what's really going on. And then internally, Dave and I also would refer to each other. We'd say, so we're talking, say, okay, Michael and I, or David and I have decided this. So even our language and communicating, whether verbally in a meeting or in an email or a text message, it's kind of like, again, how parents talk to their kids. Mom and I have decided. It presents a united front. That because, as kids will play parents
That's
against
right,
each
united
other.
front.
Same way our staff will do, try to do the same.
Yeah.
And so that has really helped us a lot in just helping people perceive rightly how things operate, how things are run, how things are decided at Together Chicago.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Curtis. I think when that change occurred, I think it was really a big change and a really good one for a lot of reasons. And we had a number, even of our board and our staff, who really asked us hard questions about it and said, "Are you sure?" Like Michael said, like this has never been done before to our knowledge, and this could be a big disaster. But Michael and I really felt then and still feel today that kind of given the DNA of who we say we are, right? We're Together Chicago. If we don't model that togetherness, like literally every day by saying, no, we're truly co-equals. And Michael can speak into anything in the organization, as can I. And so there's no off limits questions. If we can't model that and live that on a daily basis, we shouldn't be calling ourselves Together Chicago. And so it may not work for other organizations, but given what we've set out to do and the mission God has called us to, we think it's a unique way to kind of model that for people. And once people got that, they were like, that is so cool. I mean, even people on our staff said, I really admire the way that you kind of power share that way. It shows a certain humility and all that. So anyway, not that we're perfect. I'm not trying to
Mhm.
make us sound better than we are, but we really believe in this idea, and I think so far it's worked really well.
Okay, my last substantive question to both of you is that um, I imagine there might be some listeners that have been inspired by what you have shared, that they have some issue in their own community that feels intractable. Maybe it's gun violence, maybe it's homelessness, or maybe it's something else. And they maybe hear what you're saying, like, boy, it'd be really inspiring and
Mhm.
hopeful to be involved in something like this. How do I get started? What advice would you give them based out of your own experience? How does somebody get started in a creative, redemptive
Thanks,
response to
Curtis.
some
I would
evil in
say,
their own local
and
community?
David has alluded to
Michael,
this
when you start
earlier,
first, and then I'd like to hear
I
David's.
would say to start with prayer. Um, whatever issue touches you deeply, usually it's because God wants you to be involved and engaged in some redemptive way about that issue. And so you then need to pray, to seek to hear the voice of the Lord that says, this is the way, walk in it. That still small voice of God, trying to discern. And so even when my wife and I were trying to discern God's voice about what my role in Together Chicago should be, as the organization began to grow, I had a decision to make as I felt drawn to be more engaged in Together Chicago than in my church. But I'd never, for 20 something years, I'd been pastoring a local church. So if I'm not pastoring a local church anymore, who am I and what am I? And so we went on a prayer retreat together, my wife and I, to discern God's will. And then I
Mm,
came and spoke with
yeah.
David, and I said, David, I think this is what God wants me to do. And so we then made a decision together to resign from the church and then to go into Together Chicago full time, which was a big decision and a big step of faith, but it begins with prayer. Secondly, I would say get a lot of counsel and advice from others who may have a similar heart and angst about a particular issue in your community, in your city, in your state, and get wisdom. Begin asking a lot of hard questions so that you can understand the why behind the what. Um, and so Dave and I did the same thing as you heard about our focus groups. We formed these focus groups to prayerfully ask hard questions and to learn to understand what is going on. What is the drivers behind this issue, this social ill in my city, my town, my state? And once you get, after a period of time, you gather all this data, this information. You're praying now, okay, God, now what? What am I going to do with all this information? Is it actionable information? Can I act on this? And if so, how do you want me to act on this? And is there a partner or somebody or some group that I can begin to form some sort of new group or organization, or join an existing organization that's doing something about this issue, which I now have learned so much about and I care so much about? Is that what you want me to do? And so throughout the whole process, there's prayer involved, obviously, to God, and then there's counsel involved with other people that you're involving in the process to discern what is my responsibility and what can I do? What are the resources that God has entrusted to me that I can then deploy to make a difference in this space? So that's what I would say.
David, anything you'd want to add to that very sage and pastoral bit of advice?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd add two more things. One is I think there's an element what's commonly called sort of in this
Hmm.
kind of work asset mapping, which is the idea of going into the community and seeing what's already there, right?
Mm,
Because to Michael's point, the last thing anyone wants to do is go and start something that already exists. There's no reason for that. And as a donor for many years, one of my pet peeves, frankly, with nonprofits is, there's another nonprofit doing exactly what you're doing, a block away. Like you guys should join forces, right? And so I think there's this really important step in what is already going on in my community and making sure you really know what's going on before you do anything else. I think that's step one. I think step two is also there's a personal sort of validation and sort of acceptance of as you socialize ideas that you might have with people, what's their reaction to you, right? I mean, do they accept you as a leader? Do they accept you as someone that has something to add or to
Mhm.
share? And I can just share personally, like as a business guy, what I've been really surprised at and pleased at is that the fact that I'm a business guy has actually given me more credibility, not less credibility in some of this work. It's interesting. Like, I found that, if I went into a meeting with the mayor's office and said, I'm a nonprofit leader, that's fine. I mean, they'll talk to nonprofit leaders. But if I'm a business guy with a different kind of vested interest in the city, they'll have a different conversation with you, right?
Mm.
And so it's interesting. Like we each bring different things to that. So I think it's for someone who wants to do something. It's kind of like in the Bible when God said to Moses, "What's in your hand?" Right? What are the things that you
Mm.
already have about yourself that God can use? And I think Michael and I have both tried to do that in our own ways. What are the gifts we have? What's the network we have? And so I think there's a personal assessment process you kind of have to go through, and then people will either validate or not validate, your role in that. They may say, "You're not really that good at that. Why don't you do something else?" They might say, "This is perfect for you." So does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. Great bit of advice. I love that idea about asset mapping, both what's around you, but also what is God has given you
Mm.
as well. Well, guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. It's been fun, inspiring, affirming in so many ways. I want to end now with the same three questions I ask all new guests on the Good Faith podcast, and that's asking you to call our listeners to good faith, to good news, to hope and joy. And so, my first question is about good news,
Oh,
and this is to
Curtis,
you,
here's the good
Michael.
news.
What
The
piece
good
of good
news is
news do you
that
have to share with our
we have
listeners?
found, like uh, in the Old Testament, where the scriptures talk about a remnant, we have found a remnant of God's people in politics, in the police department,
Mm.
in other nonprofits, in so many areas and spheres where we need help. We have found a remnant of God's people who are willing to partner with us or to lead their respective organization, whether it's in business, government, law, social sector services, to say, we want to partner with you. We love what you are doing. We love your vision. We want to, and as a result of that, we have created all these partnerships. So there's this big heart or big heartedness that we have found in our communities across Chicago where we are working, where God has said, here's an open door, here's an open door, here's an open door, here's a person that I have put in place of authority and influence that will open this door for you. Go and walk in that door and create that partnership to do the work that I've called you to do in this space. And so that's the good news. And I am convinced that in whatever city your listeners find themselves in today, where there are challenges, there are problems that need to be solved, where we're redemptive, God's redemptive people who are about redemptive actions, if they look with God's eyes and they listen with God's ears, they will find those people waiting and willing to join with them to act redemptively in their city. And so that is the good news.
That is such great good news, both for us to have hope for the
Hmm.
um, our society, to hope for the church, but also hope for all of you listeners out there who
Hmm.
are ensconced in various institutions of your
Hmm.
community. That God has you there for a reason, because at some point God's going to bring somebody like a Michael to you and
Hmm.
say, "Hey, the reason why God's placed you in that institution is for this
Hmm.
purpose." That's really
Hmm.
good news, and that leads to the question of hope.
Hmm.
David, what personal practice sustains your own sense of hope?
Yeah, boy, Curtis, there's so much I could say to that. I think again, personally, the thing that keeps me going is just, frankly, my own walk with Christ, right? I mean, I think it starts there, and it starts with just the personal disciplines of prayer and staying fresh in my relationship with God. But I think the other thing that's on a macro scale that's been so encouraging, we really haven't talked much about it on the podcast, but the scale of what God's doing here is just incredible. So we started with just Michael and I. We're now up to 60 staff members working across 5 areas of work. We have 22 what are called gospel justice centers. We have 70 schools. We have 170 churches. So the hope comes from not just hope in, unfounded hope, but hope on reality, right? That God is actually doing a real work. And as Michael said, people really are open. And I wish you could come, Curtis, and maybe you can someday, to some of our prayer gatherings. We have an annual prayer gathering. We've routinely had maybe 2,000-ish, sometimes more than that, people come and join to pray for our city. And it's one of the most hopeful things I've ever experienced in my life. It brings tears to my eyes when you see, red, yellow, black, and white all together praying to the same Lord Jesus Christ, pouring out their hearts for God's blessing for our city. There's nothing more hopeful than that. So that really sustains me.
Awesome. All right, last question to both of you. Joy. What is one movie, book, or other content that's given you joy recently? So be quick about this one. Just tell us what it is, Michael. You start.
All right. It's this book titled The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. It was referred to me by a friend of mine, and I've been plowing through it, some during my devotional time in the morning. And just a reminder, it's kind of like that book written many, many years ago, Piercing the Darkness by Frank Peretti. It's just a reminder of this unseen realm of good and evil that is there, and that we're on the winning side, and God is at work, marshaling His unseen army of angels, His Holy Spirit, that is at work in us and through us, and in all of the complexities of life, and that brings me joy and hope in the midst of the challenging days that I find myself in. So,
David, what about you?
Yeah, I'm rereading a book that I read many years ago that's probably familiar to you all, called The Clapham Sect: How Wilberforce's Circle Transformed Britain. It's by Stephen Tompkins. And I had read it many years ago, but I'm rereading it. And there's nothing I love more than a story about people who God's gotten a hold of, and they have a vision for their life, and God uses them in a powerful way. And that Clapham sect is it's an unbelievable story, how it transformed not just Britain, but the whole world. And anyway, I'm just so enjoying reading that. It just brings joy to me to see individuals make a difference, right? I mean, that's the story of the Bible. The individual people made a big difference in specific situations. And so I want to be one of those people, right? And it just brings joy to me.
Well, Michael and David, thank you so much for sharing your story here on the Good Faith Podcast. It's been great to learn more about it, and I look forward to staying in touch and learning more about what God is doing through your friendship, your organization, and your collective work there. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, you, Curtis.
It's been fun to be with you.
All right, listeners, and once again, invite you to join us next week when we will once again gather around the campfire.